this afternoon.
Elizabeth will not.
No?
She posted.
Okay. I haven't heard from Ken and Roma. I had tried to get a hold of them for this morning so we can make announcements and see where they are in their preparations to move to Texas. You remember Wayne and Helen, especially Wayne as he's dealing with his health issues, and Wayne had announced that his sister was struggling with COVID and some complications from that. Maybe you remember Dennis as well. Maybe remember Tanya is in Florida with one of her good friends whose husband passed away, and so she's trying to reach out down there. Jacob is in New York City for work. Josh was at Abbeville this morning. I don't think he's going to be back here. Laura is out of town, and John and Kathy are also out of town in West Virginia.
Did somebody say anything about Heather?
I had not heard anything about Heather.
She had just asked if we were going to be recording the lesson in the class.
Okay.
I know she was out of town with her family on vacation. I don't know if they are still out of town or not.
Okay. So a lot of people, a lot of different directions for a lot of different reasons, and we just need to keep everybody in our prayers. Let's begin with a word of prayer before we start this afternoon. Our Father who art in heaven, we love you, Lord. We thank you, Father, for this first day of the week. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together to worship you, to praise you, to glorify you, to honor you as our Father, as our Creator, as our God. Thank you for all the many blessings that you have blessed us with. We ask that you be with the congregation here in this place. We ask that you be with us as we have this time set aside to study your word. Help us as we look into the letter Paul wrote to the Romans. Help us that we may learn from it. Help us that we may properly learn the lessons that Paul was teaching, and help us to make the application in our lives today, that we may be better servants and be with us through this study. In Christ's name we pray. Romans 14, this was a lesson, so I guess only two were here last week, so we'll go through this. I was going to go through a little bit quicker, but we'll go through go through the context, of course, and then we'll get into making an application. Hopefully, you had some time to talk about it. I know when we left last Sunday, a lot of the afternoon, Tanya and Jake and I, we had continued discussions on this on multiple topics, and there were some things that they had brought up. I know Brittany had texted Tanya and we had some questions. Laura had talked to us and had some questions. And it's really on the making application of this. And what I realized, I only had kind of two things to make application for, like whether it was a Romans 14 issue, like maybe it's a doctrinal issue that would be separate than what Paul is talking about here, or if it was a Romans 14 issue, it would be a matter that would violate your conscience, not something you just didn't like. So one of the things Jacob was talking about his dad, there really is that third category where it's not a doctrinal issue. What about if it's not a doctrinal issue and not a matter of conscience? It's just I don't like it. We don't like it. And we're arguing against with each other as Christians, but it doesn't go so far as to violate a conscience. It's not a doctrinal issue. Now, how do we handle this thing? So as we go through, maybe we'll have some discussion on that when we get to the end as well on some of those matters that hopefully we can find ways to resolve that. Hopefully we already know ways to resolve that as Christians. It's really whether we show love to each other, really whether we show patience for each other, really whether we are trying to humble ourselves for each other or dominate each other. And those are some of the things that if we would act as Christians through when we run into these situations, we would certainly have a better result. So Romans 14, we read this last week. What we'll do is we'll just read the first 4 verses here as we go through. We'll go through some of what we did last week, and then I'll go through a little bit quicker and we'll get to making application. Romans 14, verse 1 through 4. Receive one who is weak in the faith and not over disputes over doubtful things. One believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. So some of the things we were talking about here is certainly making sure that we're not judging each other over doubtful things. When we get into application, do we find ourselves in situations today where they're doubtful things, but we're still going to judge each other, or we're still going to have conflict between one another? The eating only vegetables, not sure what that meant for them. Remember, Paul is addressing the church, the Christians that are in Rome. So he could have been addressing Gentiles that thought you couldn't eat meat at all because a lot of the meats were offered to idols. So if you went to the market and bought it, you wouldn't know if that meat had been offered to idols. So they thought that would be wrong. Potentially for some of them, it was a violation of their conscience. So it would have been wrong, even though they had the liberty to eat meat. Could have been addressing twofold. It could have been to the Jews who were not eating a lot of things under the law of Moses, and now they have that freedom to be able to eat whatever. They could have ham, but yet they thought maybe they should, maybe there's questions on both sides. Some of that's conjecture, not sure, but certainly we're directly, we have the example where Paul is writing the church in Corinth, where they're directly dealing with the issue of meats offered to idols, and that's in 1 Corinthians 8, verses 1 through 13, and he talks to them and addresses how to deal with that issue over there. Anybody have, Jack, do you have a comment on any of that? I just saw you flip it, so I wasn't sure if there was, last week we did read that passage, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13, and that's where there's a number of things that Paul's going to address. He's already started in chapter 7 about marriage, and then the next thing he goes on to addressing is now concerning the things offered to idols, and he lets them know there that we'll just read some of this beginning in verse 7. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some, with consciousness of the idol until now, eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, nor for neither if we eat are we the better, or if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours, being able to eat meat, regardless, this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against your brethren, and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes a brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. What an incredible lesson from Paul there. He doesn't care whether the thing is right or wrong. In this case, it's right. But if you thought it was wrong, I won't ever do it again. Can you imagine if you had to make that because somebody didn't fully understand what they could and couldn't do, but they thought it was wrong, and that thing was totally right and acceptable for you to be able to do, something maybe you really like to do, but then you just say no, because that's going to offend you or potentially offend you. I'm not going to. Not offend, that's the wrong word, and that's the problem I made last week. I said offend a lot. This is directly talking to violate your conscience. So it's not a matter of like, well, Chad doesn't like it and I like doing it, so I'm going to do it anyway, and I don't care if I offend Chad. I shouldn't have that attitude towards a brother anyway. But if I did, offending, something that offends is not what Paul is addressing. I think it's more serious than that. It's that violation of your conscience. When we do get into application, we do want to talk about the thing that offends as well, because I shouldn't knowingly do something that would offend my brother or sister. Any comments or questions on that? Who is the weak brother that we're talking about in Romans 14 here?
The one whose conscience gets hurt by the action.
Yeah. The one who fully doesn't understand that they are at liberty to eat this meat now, but they were raised offering these things to idols. They know that maybe a lot of this meat that ends up in the market has been offered to idols. And so they feel like this would really violate my conscience to eat this meat. But it comes back to purpose, right? What are you doing? And when we get to application, I think there's a number of things where we have issues, or some people would have issues today because of what it meant in the past. But if that's not what I'm doing right now, just because something in the past may have been wrong, but now that's not my purpose in eating the meat. The Christians that were eating that meat were going, great, I want the meat that was offered to idols. That's the one I'm going to eat. They just went and said, hey, you got some meat? Yeah, I got meat. I don't care where that came from or what happened to it before it got here. I'm just ordering meat because I want to eat a hamburger, right? I want to eat something today, and I'm just grabbing it and eating it.
I was just gonna say, and we didn't discuss, I don't think we discussed this last week either. In these situations, does the person really consider that it's a violation of their conscience? Or do they consider it's really a violation of the law?
That's a good point, Mac. That's a good point. Either way, it would, I think, be the same, right? So if they think that it's a violation of the law, more study would be in order, right? So for you and I to get down and actually study to see whether this is a doctrinal issue, because then it makes it a whole different thing. If it truly was a doctrinal issue, then yes, I should not do that anymore. But if you could show somebody, and I think one of the examples I had was something along those lines. We can jump to it now. A Catholic that becomes a Christian that you've been studying with, a friend of yours, he's a Catholic, you study with them, they become a Christian. Now at the Lord's Supper, they're not going to partake of the fruit of the vine. Why? Because they believe that that's a doctrinal thing.
And the reason I brought that up is because of a situation where somebody come to you and say, well, I realize that I have the liberty to do this, but it's still a violation of my conscience. So I don't do it. I still believe it's wrong to do it. So, I mean, how many times have we had that conversation?
Yeah.
That's the only reason why I brought it up.
Yeah.
Somebody says, oh, I understand it's okay to do it, but in my mind, I still can't bring myself.
And I think from what Paul said to the Corinthians, that I won't do it then. Once I know, if it truly violates your conscience, and I can't do that thing anymore, I certainly wouldn't want to do it with you. I might do it when you're not around, you know. I mean, I could maybe eat the meat at my house, but I'm not going to invite you over and eat meat, or I'm not going to go to your house and bring meat, in this case, right? Because I would help assist you to violate your conscience potentially. What he said in 1 Corinthians 8 was that they see you as a potentially, we say, strong Christian in there eating this meat, and you go, oh, okay, I'm emboldened then to go in and eat it too, even though while I'm doing it, it violates my conscience. Now that stronger Christian has caused you to sin. And of course, there's something passages and Jesus talks about better to no still be hung around your neck than hurt one of these little ones. How would we treat the weak brother, or how should we treat the weak brother?
Well, with love and consideration and concern for their conscience.
Not to despise, not to judge. And I would want to do that if you told me you couldn't eat bacon no more. Yeah, I'm joking. But like you see how quickly that could really make us at odds if this was something I found out really violated conscience, but it was something I really. I know that you could do it. We have liberty to do it, but you haven't come to that conclusion yet, and you tell me it still violates your conscience.
this is just a off the cuff thought. In verse 1, he says to welcome them. And some of these things seem to be things that would happen on a social occasion. You know, the eating of meats is that's not church activity. That's something you do in daily life. The observance of days, the same thing. I think there would be a tendency to end up creating a division of the meat eaters and the non-meat eaters. The meat eaters, they'll go to this restaurant, the non-meat eaters will go to this restaurant, and we'll just keep the peace by keeping everyone separate. And I wonder if his wording there of welcome them would be the idea of also being, engaging them.
I absolutely agree. I think it is, and I think that would be an easy way for us to figure this out, right? We just separate. But then how are we, and he talks about those people that have not realized that's a liberty yet, and it still violates their conscience as being the weaker ones. So we're just gonna go, hey, we're gonna leave Mac over there, and we're gonna all go eat meat. Like, what does that do for the weaker one? I mean, that's not encouraging. Hey, that's what we're supposed to do, encourage each other. We're supposed to be a family, we're supposed to grow together, we're supposed to love each other together. And how do we do that if we basically just divided ourselves into separate parties so that we don't offend each other?
Yeah, and what does that do for the unity of the congregation and fellowship?
It destroys it. It destroys it. Really what you end up with is two separate groups. And I think that's a good point that you made, Chad, is that we're supposed to, mine says receive, yours says to welcome. So to receive or welcome that one, instead of ostracizing that person, well, we're not gonna have Mac over for the barbecue because Mac doesn't think he can eat meat, right? What we would do is say, well, we're having a get together and we're eating vegetables and we're gonna invite Mac over. That's how we should have, and that's how they should have handled that situation. I think that's what Paul's trying to get to. Are we to judge? Who are you to judge another servant? You know, the servant is, has his own master, and I'm going to go judge that servant. You got to be careful because we answer to a judge as well. I put this section. Paul's not dealing with the doctrinal issues, so I think that's important because sometimes people they use Romans 14 in ways that I don't think are appropriate or accurate. One of them could be for doctrinal things. One of them could be the other side of that. Could be it's just my opinion, my likes and dislikes, and you should cater to everything that I have a problem with. You should just not do it because I have a problem with it. And I don't think that's really what's being talked about here. I think it's more serious than that. So then when you get down to verses 5 through 13, one person esteems one day over another. Another esteems every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. He who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live for the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord. So definitely setting that who the master is, making that abundantly clear. For to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. But why do you judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us shall give account to himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. So this law of liberty here, esteeming a day, how should we do it?
To God.
To the Lord, right? We esteem the day, we give God thanks for the day. Whether we're doing something, we give God thanks. Whether we're not doing it, we give God thanks. Whether we're eating, we give God thanks. When we're not eating, we give God thanks. Who should we esteem the day to? Obviously to God. Why should we not judge our brother? Talk about because he's a servant.
We're all God's servants. He's another servant. We don't have the right.
Yep. And then also, that was in the earlier verses, verse 4, where we're talking about the servant and has his own master. Why do you judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we all answer to a judge. I'm not in charge to tell Mac what to do. Mac's not in charge of telling me what to do. We're supposed to be brothers and love each other because we both answer to the judge. We both answer to God. Okay. And each of us will give account to God. So it's not our place to be judging our brother in matters of. Again, this is in matters of conscience. So this is where people take this message from Paul, and you can take it out of context, and you can say, see, you're not supposed to judge me. Look, I'll show you a verse where Paul says not to judge me. Well, this is on the matter of on conscience. This is not on a matter, on a doctrinal issue where I get turned to the verse and say, see, you're not supposed to do it. Chad says, don't judge me, I'm going to do it anyway. And I'll show you the verse where Paul says, don't judge me, right? And that's where I think this is misused and twisted by people as well. Chad?
In these things, he doesn't mention here that we need to fully understand one another. And imagine if you were raised a Gentile and you had no understanding or no care or really no comprehension of the Jewish feast. And then you had a brother who grew up a Jew, and so he was used to the Feast of Booths and the Tabernacles, which is the same thing. The other feast that I can't remember all of them right now. And to him, that's just what I've always done. And it would be hard to try to get the other one to understand their point of view. And that, I think that's where a lot of that judgment comes in of, Lee, I grew up with this, how can you not understand? And you would say, well, this isn't a part of the New Testament church, why would you keep doing that? And there's a lack of understanding, and because there's lack of understanding, well, you're wrong for not doing it, and I'm wrong for doing it, and vice versa. But that isn't a part of the command in chapter 14. It isn't figure out everyone's nuances, and then it's, regardless if you understand or not, this is how you're to act.
Yeah. And we talked, I think we got on that last week on the communication. But the lack of communication causes a lot of the problems that you have in any part of your life, let alone with religious discussions or doctrinal discussions. We need to have that good lines of communication together. We need to love each other. And to love each other, we'll communicate better together. And so we should be. Chad, being a Jew, could communicate to me why he's coming this direction at some of these things. I could communicate as a former, idol worshiper why these things are bothersome for me to do. And then once we have that strong love for each other and communication with each other about our backgrounds, we could then move forward together as a congregation and receive each other or welcome each other together. Even though we may still continue to have differences would be okay to move forward with differences unless it violated our conscience. Then we would say, hey, well, I won't do that ever again. Because I know now that it violates your conscience. And unless that changes for Chad, I would never do that thing again. As Paul said, I will never eat meat again. Now, I'm sure if he came back and visited them, or had the chance to get and visit them in Rome and find out that Chad learned, oh yeah, that's not an issue anymore. It doesn't violate my conscience. They could go together and eat meat together. That would change potentially over time and growth and knowledge of God's word and knowledge of liberty and what you can and can't do. Right?
I was just going to say, since we talk about applications, we can run into that today. We can run into a situation where somebody was formerly of a different faith or had studied various other philosophies and such. And somewhere along the line, they talk about, oh, well, what about such and such, or whatever it may be. And we realize that that's not something of the doctrine of Christ, but it's something that they have picked up or acquired.
Yeah.
Now, if it's a matter of doctrine, we need to study with them, like you have said. But if it's something that they have just picked up and they don't feel comfortable participating in that or not, or feel comfortable in participating in something like that.
Yes.
Either way, you know. Again, that's where those lines of communication is important. Why do you feel that way? And it may relate to something they've studied in some other faith, doctrine, or philosophy.
That's
And
right.
it's just stuck with them.
So how will we deal with matters of conscience with a brother? With love. Should be very carefully with love. We want to. What is the kingdom of God? Verse 17. The kingdom of God is not food and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. What should we pursue? Things that make for peace and the things by which one may edify one another. These are all important topics to help us to deal with issues when they come up. And what should we make sure to do in verse 21?
Not do anything that causes your brother to stumble.
Nothing. Nothing that would cause you to stumble should I do, regardless of the freedom or liberty that I have to do said thing. If I know that it's going to cause you to stumble, my attitude should be one of humble submission, love, wanting to cause peace and joy for each other. So then I put here, before we get into making some application for the last few minutes here, Paul's not addressing just your whims, just your likes and dislikes and you're crazy. We're all crazy in our own ways. We've got crazy ideas and crazy things. That's fine. But that's not what Paul was addressing, just silly things here. This was serious. Because again, it's leading to sin. Anything that leads to sin is serious. This isn't a joke. This isn't what I like and you like. This is conscience. Violation of conscience is a sin. If the thing rises to that level, then this is not just well, Chad, he's just weird that way and he likes doing, he says you can't do that and that's stupid. And I know better, so I'm doing it anyway. That's a sin. That's a sin. That's not catering to women. So to make application, we're told not to worship because of COVID. This is a serious issue because people up in Canada for like almost a year and a half have not been able to go into their church buildings. In fact, I believe they're still sitting in the parking lot where they've spray painted 6-foot lines and they're worshiping in Wellandport, Ontario, Canada, outside of the building. They still can't go into the building. Ironically, you go down the street though if you wanted and go to the casino and you could gamble your life savings away because for whatever reason, COVID doesn't impact the casino as much as it does churches. But churches, so this isn't just a silly question. This is serious. These Christians have been told they cannot worship God, at least together in their church buildings, and church buildings have been closed for a long time. It didn't go that severely here, and we obviously we almost were there, but for the most part, the country did not say church buildings cannot be open. They did limit, and we did have issues for a while. Well, what do we do if that's the case? What do we do if tomorrow Echo variant comes out and we end up being told we can't worship? You have to lock the door and you cannot come together.
We worship anyway.
So is that a Romans 14 issue? No, that I believe would be a doctrinal issue, and that would be, if you look at Acts, you know the passage there in Acts chapter 5 when the apostles were teaching and preaching Christ. They were beaten for it, they were put in jail for it, then they were released and told, don't ever say another thing about Jesus, and what did they do? They said, and then the captain went out with the officers and brought them with violence, for they feared the people lest they should be stoned. And when they had brought them in and set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in his name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Here would be a case of we need to put God first, man second.
Go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, I was going to say, this would be different with maybe the mask issue, right? When it was state mandated that we wear masks. Should we wear masks? Absolutely. Wholly different issue. We need to obey the laws of the land that God has set up, and we could look at, and we'll study Romans 13. Romans 13, Paul covers how to handle governments. The government can make a law that we like or don't like, it doesn't matter, we still have to follow it, right? So when we had a state mandate for something, we need to do that, but when it crosses the line of not being able to worship God, and being able to worship God, we're going to cross that line, or at least Christians ought to cross the line. But that's not a Romans 14 issue, right?
Well, I was gonna say too, you also have to look at how whatever that rule is, how it was issued, like one of the things you mentioned. Most, even across the US, most of the congregations were not able to worship the way it come together as they normally had. But they still found ways to assemble and come together.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, so we still found a way to obey God and to render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar.
Yeah.
But you know, like you say, now, if it had come out just totally,
Yes.
you can't come together, you can't do this. And there are societies under communist control. We talk about China today,
Yes.
what those brethren have to endure to worship.
Yeah.
And they're willing to do that.
That's right. So here's an issue, worship times and order of services. And what we learned, is this a Romans 14 issue? It could be, right? How do we find out? I think it's silly, actually, or it should be silly, but in saying that, that could be offensive to some. Let's say we're gonna take the Lord's Supper from before and move it till after. This was an issue here 12, 15 years ago. It was an issue in this congregation. And the issue was it was offending some people when we did that. We did that move without knowing what everybody felt about it. And we did it because we thought we were trying to help some people that worked and got in a little bit late, so we moved it afterwards. If they ran late, they would be able to take the Lord's Supper. And then later, after making that decision, we found out it was offensive to some. Now, I don't know if it's offensive to the point of violating conscience. I don't believe so, but we found out that was offensive. So what did we have to do to fix that problem? We had to communicate together so we knew that. We made a decision that offended somebody without even knowing we were offending somebody. And then they did not understand why the decision was made. They thought it was a whim decision. We just liked it afterwards. So everybody came together after that. The good thing with this group 15 years ago when that happened was once it was explained, once the communication was made, they understood why the move happened, and everybody showed love towards each other, and that was a good thing. Had it been a matter of conscience, what should we or would we have done? Move the thing back, right? So I believe this is not a matter of, generally not a Romans 14 issue. This is a matter of love and, you know, humbling yourselves to each other, showing love, preference for one another. But some people have really been ingraining the way they've lived their lives and grown up that this could be an issue. One thing I didn't put on there is, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, that issue you brought up also stresses the importance of good communication. If it had been explained at like several times the congregation met, we have changed the order of service. This is why it was changed. You tell somebody beforehand, and then you tell because we know people are out. You do it several times. So that also shows the importance of good communications within
Yeah,
congregation, because if that had occurred, that might have been avoided. Also, those people should need to bring that issue if it was a violation.
Yes, yes,
I mean,
and that should change how we handle that. Immediately, we could easily, hopefully take care of that if I knew, you know, I had just violated, you know, the conscience of Tamika by moving some time or something. If that truly was how we felt, then immediately our reaction as Christian brothers and sisters should be to make that right, to not violate conscience. I didn't want to get on it because I know we're want to run out of time again, but one of the things that goes with this is like a second serving of the Lord's Supper. Some people don't agree with the second serving of the Lord's Supper. If you have two services, we don't. So we've avoided all these things by having one service time on Sunday. But places that have two, sometimes that's offensive to some. I personally don't agree with the second service of the Lord's Supper, but it's not a violation of my conscience. So I could sit here at 5 o'clock this afternoon and we could offer the Lord's Supper to somebody that missed. I don't agree with that, but I can sit here and fellowship with you all and worship with you all without making it a matter of conscience. Now, am I proud and arrogant and I tell you that's a matter of my conscience? I better be careful if I do that, because it better truly violate my conscience. I better not use this as a tool. And I've seen some people use Romans 14 as a tool to get their way. Oh, you don't like that, Tamika? Well, it violates my conscience. Oh, okay. So then Tamika and the whole congregation lets us do this thing. That's the way I wanted it, and I'm getting my way. And I'm using this really. It's horrible. Whoever to truly do that. What are you going to say? Jeff?
I think you and I agree with that of the second serving of the Lord's Supper, and most places that we have worked have. And my only request has been for me not to be scheduled to officiate.
Yes.
And everyone's been really good about that. And it's one of those things that just because I don't fully agree with it doesn't mean that it needs to be an issue. It doesn't need to make a stink out of it.
Exactly.
And there's ways for us to work together with it.
And when we all love each other and communicate correctly together, I think we can get through issues like that. What about like Christmas trees, giving gifts? This could be an issue for some people. And again, some of these issues are rooted in what has happened in the past. That's exactly what happened in Romans 14. Romans 14 in the past, this was meat offered to idols, and I used to participate in that. Now I'm not offering meat to offer to idols anymore because I love God, and I'm not eating that meat anymore because I know where it was offered. So it was, the meat had something to do with sinful things in my past, and I've learned about that, or I knew about that, or I used to participate in that, and now it's a sinful thing. I don't want to get into all the Christmas tree debate, Christmas, celebrate Christmas, not and all that. But we know that where some of these things come from, right? Like, I don't even know. You could go all the way back to Leviticus and you could see that they actually had a feast of grain or something. I'm not sure. I think I wrote down something. Where they would cut branches, they would have a number of branches and stuff. So some Christians could look back and go, see, I could show you a scripture that shows that they had these branches and limbs and things like that. Somebody's looking at me weird, so I better find the verse to actually back up what I'm saying. Leviticus 23, verse 40. I'm not trying to say this justifies having a Christmas tree. Don't take me out of context here when I'm mentioning this, but this is what some people would say. So in the Feast of Tabernacles, verse 40, you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy greens and willows from the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord God for 7 days. So there's my justification for the Christmas tree, right? I'm not saying that, I'm saying that. Or you could bounce forward to the 4th century and you could say, well, this was a pagan thing. You should not have anything to do with the Christmas tree because it came from pagan worship. The pagans in the 4th century, in the winter, during the winter solstice, would grab these branches of green trees and put them in their house. So it's a pagan thing, you shouldn't do it. Or you could bounce to the 16th century and say, well, Christians did it, in the 16th century. And that's in Germany where some people say it started. So I say all that to say, how were you raised, I think, often is where this comes from. Were you raised to think that Christmas was a pagan thing that turned into a Christian thing? Could this be a Romans 14 issue? I think it could be. Because it could be so strongly rooted in however you're raised to either do these things or not do these things that it might be a violation of somebody's conscience. So we need to learn and study from each other, right? The giving of gifts is also another thing like that that came from potentially pagan roots. But why do you, if you enjoy Christmas, and I'm not talking about enjoying Christmas as the birth of Jesus, but just as a holiday, if you enjoy that as a Christian and celebrate that as a holiday, and some people would refuse to do that because they think that that is, came from pagan roots, so we should have nothing to do with it. How do we handle that? much like the Lord's second serving of the Lord's Supper, like I had said. As long as it's not a violation of somebody's conscience, then we should be able to meet together or not meet together, participate or not participate in these things together. Any comments? Questions on that? No? Infant baptism, I think it's a matter of doctrine, not a Romans 14 issue. But where could it be potentially lean also towards a Romans 14 issue? I think somebody that was raised their entire life, say in a Catholic background, to believe that this is doctrine, that doctrine is to, that's where a little bit of study and trying to correct on the meaning of baptism and who got baptized and whether they had any say in that, which they did, and they had to have faith and they had to believe. So you might have somebody that really believes this is a matter of conscience. I told you the nurse when her son died at birth said, well, I'm going to take him to baptize him. And he says, no, it's okay. And she did anyway, against her will. Basically, I told her no, and she went and baptized him anyway. Brought back a little baptism robe and ring and everything else. Why'd she do that? She's just a mean person. She was a loving person who really thought that this baby's soul was in jeopardy and needed to baptize this child, right? So that was a matter of conscience for that woman. She was trying to do the right thing. We could have people that become Christians that this could be a matter of conscience for them, even though it's also a doctrinal issue, right? So they might be wrong because it's a doctrinal, they're wrong on the doctrinal issue, but it could also be a conscience thing, and we would have definitely a lot of study for somebody like that, right? And that goes back to the person that might be, not think that you partake of the fruit of the vine. They need to do that. But initially, they may violate their conscience to do it, so it may take some time and studying with that person before they get to the point they realize they have the liberty to do that. Does that make any sense? Hopefully I'm not being too confusing here. Men's meeting versus congregational meeting. This was one of the questions that Laura had for us. These are things that, so what would this be, Chad? Romans 14 issue?
I think to some degree it would be.
It could be, right? It depends on how. I'll tell you real quick what happened. We were members of a congregation where this became an issue. So we had studies, specific dedicated studies to figure out how to do this. At the end of all those studies and all that time, all the men of the congregation agreed that we would have congregational meetings. And we started having all these studies because one man had said he disagreed with that and it should be congregational, right? So we had Bible studies for a long period of time to determine. Of course, we're operating without authority. We're operating outside of the actual scriptural authority is elders and deacons, right? So we're trying to continue to operate when we're not scripturally organized. So anyway, the congregation decided we have men's meetings. Well, guess what happened when that decision was made? This person said this is a matter of conscience. Didn't say that at the beginning, but after all of this study and then the decision went against what he thought, he said it was a matter of conscience. So what do? We had congregational meetings. I mean, what can you do, right? Now, is that person, and I'm not the judge, we already learned we're not supposed to judge, did that person change their mind or not tell us at the beginning it was a matter of conscience and wait until later to tell us a matter of conscience? Was it because he wasn't getting his way? I don't know, but I'm not the judge of him and his conscience. But I do know, according to what Paul taught me, is not to violate a brother's conscience. So when he made it clear this was a violation of conscience, we changed. Even though we didn't just agree that we were going to go this way, we changed and went this way. Again, because both those things are kind of operating outside of how congregations are supposed to be set up. What about salt making unleavened bread? This is an issue. Some people have been raised that that's a sin to have salt in the mixing up of unleavened bread. Some people, you can read in some place, that's not the right answer, is it? You could read,
The Hebrew writer did it. It was once written at some point.
where is that? It's Leviticus 2:13 or something, where it talks about everything that is offered to God needs to have salt in it. So does unleavened bread need to have salt in it? that has been an issue, and I know sometimes I don't know if it raises to Romans 14 issue, because if all of a sudden I hand you the bread to make it, and this violates her conscience to have bread with salt on it, and I just made unleavened bread with salt on it, could it be? Now, how am I going to know that? You just got to tell me, right? This violates my conscience because I don't think the unleavened bread should have salt in it. Then that would be something, as long as it's made known, we would make sure we don't do that, right? Look, where did we say?
I never heard of the salt non-salt question until it was years after we were married, and we had the conversation about it that Brittany's mom believed it to be a leavening agent. Never had heard of that before. Never occurred to me. And still, she's the only person I've ever heard talk about the salt non-salt, and I was just wondering is this a thing?
I figured you would have got that in West Virginia, because there's a strong leaning towards that from folks from West Virginia, but that it's wrong to have salt in unleavened bread. But anyway, these are things that, how would we even know unless we tell each other? Again, does it raise to the level of violating your conscience? Is it just, I don't think we should, and you think we should? We can agree, we can deal with that, hopefully, as brothers and sisters. But if it was offending a conscience, we would want to make sure that we don't do something that would offend the conscience. Oh, here I'm looking. No wonder I couldn't find the verse, because I had it on the slide.
Yeah, I looked it up. It's
I was looking all through my little stickies here, and I couldn't find it. And there it is. Leviticus 2:15. And then, so here we are, second time around, we still didn't get finished. Paul says, love one another, be kind, live in joy, and live with peace with one another. So I have more verses, but we're not going to have time to read them, so let's just read this last one. James 3:13. James 3:13 to 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? To him, let him show by good conduct that the works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, and if that's what I'm doing, right? If it's from envy and self-seeking, I want my way, it violates my conscience. If that's what I'm doing, that causes confusion, and every evil thing will be there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceful, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. I think that's the way that we handle all these things. To wrap it all up, we won't read the passage, but we know how you ought to conduct yourself as a Christian. We'll look at that when we get to that in Romans chapter 12. This is how we should conduct ourselves, and so let's make sure we're properly conducting ourselves with love towards one another. And then Jesus taught us to be very careful not to cause anyone to sin. It'd be better if a millstone were hung around your neck and be tossed into the sea than that you would cause one of these little ones to sin. Thanks. If you have any questions, let me know afterwards. I appreciate it.